This section is about structuring your questions and your team structuring your approach and your strategy. So first, let's look at how you structure a question. There are so many ways to ask a question. I mean, it ultimately depends on why you're asking it and what you want to achieve by it. I mean, questions are used by lawyers, sociologists, journalists, academics, countries even, to provoke, get answers, inform, educate, to start conversations, to shut people down, to challenge, to coach them through a solution, to ridicule, to provoke thinking, or to be rhetorical. Yes, they can do all this and more. Richard Feynman, an American theoretical physicist who invented nanotechnology, famously got annoyed when a journalist asked him, why do magnets repel each other?
I mean, the sensation is that there's something there when you push these two magnets together.
Listen to my question. What is the meaning when you say that there's a feeling? Of course you feel it. Now what do you want to know?
What I want to know is what's going on between these two bits of metal.
Magnets repel each other.
And well, then what does that mean, or why are they doing that, or how are they doing it?
You're asking.
I must say, I think that's a perfectly reasonable question.
Of course, it's a reason. It's an excellent question. Okay. But the problem that you're asking, you see, when you ask why something happens, how does a person answer why something happens? Why does water expand when it freezes and other substances don't expand when they freeze? All right? I'm not answering your question, but I'm telling you how difficult a why question is. You have to know what it is that you're permitted to understand and allowed to be understood and known, and what it is you're not. Now, when you ask, for example, why two magnets repel, there are many different levels. It depends on whether you're a student of physics or an ordinary person who doesn't know anything or not. If you're somebody who doesn't know anything at all about it, all I can say is that there's a magnetic force that makes them repel, and that you're feeling that force. So I'm not going to be able to give you an answer to why magnets attract each other, except to tell you that they do, and to tell you that that's one of the elements in the world of different kinds of forces. There are electrical forces, magnetic forces, gravitational forces, and others, and those are some of the parts. If you were a student, you'd go further. I could go further. I could tell you that the magnetic forces are related to the electrical forces very intimately, that our relationship between the gravity forces and electrical forces remains unknown, and so on. But I really can't do a good job, any job, of explaining magnetic force in terms of something else that you're more familiar with, because I don't understand it in terms of anything else that you're more familiar with.
The reason he got annoyed? Because he doesn't know at what level of understanding the person asking the question can deal with. The why question could be answered in different ways according to who is asking the question. So when you're interviewing an expert, you need to be really clear what information you want them to explain to you and the context of how you want it explained. Why? So they can give you the complex answer in the terms you need. Otherwise, you may not understand their answer, or you may not get to the detail of the answer that you need. Let's face it, you're not meant to be an expert on this topic. You're meant to be there to represent your constituents. So context creates clarity. This is why some of the best questions you can structure for experts are these three. What are the top three things that are challenging in this field to get right? Or what are the key areas we need to explore when rewriting policy in this area? Or what if money were no object? What would be the best option? Now, they're just simple examples, but what are the top three things and what are the key areas? What these two questions do, these first two, combine the clarity of what you need, the challenges of the sector, while using their expertise to filter out the key information. Usually I find that if you ask this question, the expert knows exactly how to answer it for you. But if you need more detail because you understand the topic at more depth, give them a steer that they can deepen into the detail a little bit more. Now, the last one of those questions, the what if question, it's interesting because Fundamentally, that's a hypothetical question, and it's not liked by the legal profession and some journalists on the whole. But it's very useful to help sieve out what is important to the expert or other key member. It can identify the key gaps in a subject. I've interviewed many people who've been on committees as a witness, and a few charity spokespeople have said that they love being asked the what if question because it gives them an opportunity to explain their ideal scenario. Generally, though, the what question can take many forms, but the formula of what are the top 3 things or the 3 key areas usually means that you're asking someone to decide what the key options are. And this is one of the most useful ways to start a question when you want to find out options, facts, and actions. But we might be getting ahead of ourselves. In this masterclass, we want to give you an overview of the different ways to structure a question. But before we do, I want every time you write or think of a question, I want you to ask yourself, how easy is it to answer the question clearly with precision? If its purpose you're trying to get clarity on. How easy is it to avoid the question if you're trying to challenge them? And thirdly, how easy is it to answer a different question without it being too obvious? So let's first of all look at one approach. This is called the funneling question approach and is used and taught to many detectives. Its title is Ted's Pie. The very open starter question is TEDS, which stands for Tell Me, Explain, Describe, Show, or Sketch. Now let's face it, you might not use show or sketch that often, but sometimes, for example, if you're talking to somebody in the construction industry or engineering, it might be useful for them to draw something in a committee. But this gets people talking quite a lot. They're very, very open questions at the top of the funnel, but they're very useful to start conversations going. And if you want to try and gather information and educate yourself. So they're particularly useful if you're doing expert panels or expert conferences and you want to get to know more information. The next level down the funnel is PI, and we add this to TED. So PI stands for precisely, in detail, and exactly. And what you do when paired up with TEDs, you can mix it in a little bit. So tell me in detail, or explain exactly, or describe precisely. You can mix them up in any way you want. And this way that you're getting down more into the more focused detail. It's a great way to plan and the structure of your question. You can then move down the funnel again to what's called the 5WH horse. It's called a horse because it can be very difficult to get off it. And you can go round and round with who, what, why, where, when, and how. This is the fabulous 5 and the 1H questions that loads of journalists use, and it can help you work out how to probe and be curious. Lastly, in the funnel, there's the closed questions. Are you? Do you? Have you? Now, we need to be aware that the closed questions are definitely not questions to start with. Why? Because they're easily avoided. People simply answer the closed question with a short reply, the closed bit, yes, that's interesting, or no, and then they deliver whatever they fancy after it, usually their pre-prepared message. Sometimes they might answer it with a yes or a no reply, which isn't going to be very helpful. Or it's so easy for them to refocus in any response that they wish without it being blatantly obvious or that they're doing it. So you've got to be really clever when you use a closed question. You've got to think about what the viewers or listeners or the people at home or the peers that are watching it, what do they really want to know? So try out TED's Pie in your structure preparations. Now, there are some questions that you don't need to prepare, but that can be great supplementaries to get the answers that you need. These are called nudge questions, little words that prompt a response. And because, yes, and then a pause. Here, Clive Betts uses it in the CLG committee, the Communities and Local Government Committee in the UK, to try and get the headline that he knew he wanted.
I think you're using words now to avoid answering the question. Are you prepared on behalf of Ofsted to apologise to the children of Rotherham for past failings in failing to identify this issue of child
Chair, I
sexual
believe very
education?
strongly that there are apologies due on every front, on the regulators' front,
No,
within the community, within other inspectorates. I think that's the important
No,
thing.
I'm not asking. The other inspectors and other regulators are not before me today and not before the committee. I'm asking you if you're now prepared to apologise on behalf of Ofsted for past failings in this matter.
I think that you are taking my comments
No, I'm asking
out
for a
of
straightforward
context,
answer.
Mr. Bates.
I'm asking for a straightforward answer.
I think what
I'm asking
I am
for a
doing,
straightforward. Are you refusing to give one?
I hear what you're saying. I've responded very clearly
No, you haven't.
on what we have done.
No, you haven't. You haven't given me a straight answer. Are you prepared to apologise?
What I have said
The words are quite
is
easy
that
to say.
that we in Ofsted, along with everybody else, feel that what we have done is not good enough.
Right. I'm sorry.
Of course we're sorry.
That's an
Of
apology.
course
then.
we're sorry. We're sorry along with, I'm sure, everybody else that has
absolutely.
been
Other people have
presented
apologised.
in
Right.
front of this committee.
Yes.
And I think that it's important that I say that in the context of where we were then.
That was Clive Betts getting the answer that he wanted, the headline he wanted from a senior member in Ofsted. Nudge questions are great, but sometimes you don't even need them. Sometimes offering a void, a pause, a silence can get you a gem.
I'm not talking in the context of a studio interview because I'm out and about doing my interviews, and I think that I would say be prepared for anything and use it to your advantage. You might be in a dire situation and you might just get gold. So your mind has to be open. You mustn't make your mind up in advance. And the other tip I would give you is know when to shut up. Because sometimes when you're interviewing somebody and it's been a long interview and you know they haven't quite given you it, sometimes if you just stop and they're in full flow and you just listen and you really encourage and you don't say anything and you don't think I'm the person that matters here and my voice is going to be heard, you just keep quiet, they will give you that gem because they will continue talking and they'll give you the thing that you would never get by constantly asking the question. So know when to shut up is my other bit of advice.
So Ted's Pie and the nudge are useful for 4 reasons. Ted's Pie is a great crib sheet for planning how to structure your questions. It's a great guide to how to start your first question. And it helps you to think about how precise or how open you want your question at the start to be. And it helps you think on your feet. If you want to dig deep, go to the 5WH horse and keep going on about those who, what, where, when, why, hows. Working out the best way to get the answer that you want. And if you're finding it tricky, leave the space and let them fill it. Another approach is the spiral approach. Here, Simon Reevell, MP, he asks a witness to clarify what their job role is. Now, it should be said it's important for members to be respectful of their witness and to be aware of how they ask the questions of civilians, experts, and also the vulnerable. This example is quite far into the questioning strategy and the witness wasn't really answering in the way that they wanted. This example is to show you the spiral technique in action. Spiral questioning is when you ask an open question, get the answer from the witness, summarize it in your own words, and then get them to agree or disagree with your summation. Then you move to the next open question. You'll see here how the open question is more difficult to avoid than the closed question.
Yes.
And they pay £16,000 each per year.
Indeed.
So somewhere just over £500,000 goes into the kitty.
Yeah.
What do they get for their collective £500,000?
Well, they get a facilitator in the sense that they get a secretariat that can help them on the business improvement programmes, be it on diversity, health and safety, etc., etc.
So do you devise the programmes?
Yes. Well, when it was UK...
Do you devise the programmes?
I provide advice, but the individual companies essentially devise the programme. So, to give you an example...
I don't know an example, but thank you. But so they pay £16,000 and they come up with their own programme. So what are they paying the £16,000 for?
For the services of me and my other 3 members of staff to facilitate whatever plan or programme they've got.
So if I'm a member company and I've paid you £16,000 and I've come up with my plan, how do you facilitate that plan?
Well, we facilitate plan. We agree some objectives for the year. We have a business plan. I'm happy to share that business plan with the committee for this year. It will have activities on it, for example, in health and safety that we're...
You're not really answering my question. My question was, how do you facilitate the plan that I've come up with? You've told us that you facilitate the members' plans. So I'm a member. I have a plan. What do you do? How do you facilitate?
Well, in a sense, the members will facilitate their own plan because we'll set a committee up. It may be a committee that would just meet for 2 or 3 occasions.
Right, so I've paid you £16,000. I've come up with my own plan. I've now facilitated my own plan. So what am I getting for my £16,000?
You're getting the collective agreement of 31 other member companies in terms of...
When you started in '97, you were Director of Public Affairs.
Yes.
So is this effectively a PR company?
It certainly does PR, and we've published a report.
What else does it do that was not PR?
Best practice.
But does it actually devise any best practice, or does it just publicise it?
No, we follow best practice, and we put into play toolkits to endeavour to have our companies follow.
Well, do you devise any best practice?
Certainly the toolkit that we published to try and avoid and minimise cable strikes is a good example of best practice.
Yes, I asked you if you devise... I mean, I'll just sit here and ask you until you answer. Do you devise best practice?
No, it's good practice, and it's devised by getting it from other people. So another example would be cycle safety, where we've been talking a lot to the Quarry Products Association about how lorries going to sites can do that more safely.
So do you generate anything new in terms of method and procedure from within your organisation, or do you simply take it from one member and pass it around the others?
I would say the latter. I mean, we are trying to spread good practice.
Right. So you are effectively a PR company for these firms.
We certainly do PR on their behalf, but we also facilitate best practice.
What?
You do need to be good at being polite and determined, but you also have to be good at interrupting. It's best done with clear guidelines at the beginning. You need to be able to say to your witnesses, we may need to interject if you're asking long questions or we don't feel you're answering the question. But that's much better at the start of the session. Now, this approach does take practice, but it's worth getting good at. And it's great if you do, because it's a great way to probe and get clarity. So make sure whatever you do not make statements, but ask questions clearly without mixing your facts up. If you don't, you may not get the answer you want.
Mr. Heyman, don't you understand that the public will just see you as a dodgy geezer who is in charge of a phone hacking inquiry conducted by the News of the World, who resigned from the force amongst allegations of expenses claims and allegations of improper conduct with 2 females, who has told this committee today that you had no knowledge of editors or sub-editors of the Times, while cozying up to the executive level of News International, and amazingly received an award for this investigation.
Not for this investigation, no.
No, we wouldn't have expected you to receive.
Sorry.
Well,
I must apologise. I have read that.
Apart from that last bit,
I have read that, but.
And you might end up being on the front pages of the next day's newspapers, and you might not want that. Another way to prepare your question is to prepare the quick fire round to keep the minister on their toes. Generally, I say prepare about 5 quick fire questions, and they need to be short, and you need to give them no time to think. You want to ask them one at a time. Ask a question, answer. Ask a question, get an answer.
Thanks for your presentation, gentlemen. What's our steps now? What's your timeline for legislation and direction?
Well, the position now is that we have advised the Minister that we will bring forward policy options based on the views expressed through the consultation process, the views expressed by the DCAL committee, other stakeholders.
If you don't get that legislation in place, what's your plan B for next year?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's an option that we'll put to the Minister, and it'll be a matter for her to decide as to what action we take.
Would it be similar to this year's voluntary?
Well, I wouldn't want to, speculate as to what the Minister would suggest, what she would do, but I think it's reasonable to assume that there would be similar measures.
You mentioned earlier on of the commercial men. There's court proceedings underway. Is that not going to hamper and affect us and bringing forward legislation if that's in place?
No, the department's currently given consideration to that issue, and we will be taking it forward in consultation with the Minister, but we don't see that as an obstacle.
That's right. You mentioned earlier on your involvement with Save the Salmon and Fisheries Forum. Where are they now as a collective body in regard to this presentation of this?
Yeah, well, SIF offered very useful and comprehensive comments in relation to the consultation exercise.
And you also want to make sure that your question doesn't open up too long a response. Again, if you've done your guidelines right, it should work. But even if you haven't, sometimes you need to be able to read your witness and work out whether they're going to answer too long, and maybe ask them to be more concise. But you can also get really clever with your structure. This takes a bit of time. Here is Jim Fitzpatrick telling us about his most favourite question of all time.
I always find it's easier to interview somebody on the facts rather than and to interrogate them on the basis of their logic, particularly we take our own political situation. Say for instance this question about Gerry Adams, were you in the IRA? And he says no, goes back and forth, and then eventually everybody says you're in the IRA, and he says, well, of course they'll think that if people like you keep saying it, and then suddenly you've become a biased, part of the problem. The best question I think was ever asked, and it was asked a number of years ago in a youth programme where a kid from West Belfast put his hand up and said, Gerry, why did you never join the IRA?
So, there are a number of other ways to approach your planning and structure. You've got to think of your first open question. You've got to be clear what your intention is and use nudging and silence as tactics for supplementaries. You can plan a quick fire round. You can use a surprise structure that's not obvious, but it's easily planned for. Ask short questions. Ask one question at a time. I mean, there are other formats which we will cover in longer bespoke courses, but these approaches are great ways to think about structuring your questions effectively. So earlier I asked you to think about when you're writing a question to ask yourself, how easy is it for them to answer this question, to avoid the question, or to answer a completely different question? Can you see that unless your question is well structured, it can be easy for an expert to be unsure how to answer it? And unless your question is obvious, then it might be that if you ask it in a bit of an obscure way, they might be able to avoid the question very easily. And also, if you ask more than one question, if you ask two or more questions at once, if you ask close questions or you ask long rambling questions, it means that the interviewee can answer in whichever way they want. They'll be able to answer any way they want, and very, very few people will notice that they've done it.